Hey guys, welcome back. So today we need to talk about something that, honestly, sounded almost impossible not that long ago. Vladimir Putin is now saying the war in Ukraine may actually be coming to an end. And this comes right as a 3-day ceasefire, reportedly brokered by Donald Trump, has started between Russia and Ukraine. Now, if you've followed this war over the last 4 years, you probably know why people are reacting with a mix of hope, confusion, and skepticism all at once. Because we've heard talk about ceasefires before, we've heard negotiations before, and every single time, the fighting came back. But this moment feels a little different. Not necessarily because peace is suddenly around the corner, it probably isn't, but because the tone coming from Moscow has changed. And in geopolitics, tone matters. Putin saying the matter is coming to an end is a pretty huge statement, especially from a leader who spent years insisting Russia would achieve all of its military goals no matter how long it took. Think about where we are now. Russia invaded Ukraine back in February 2022, expecting a quick victory. The Kremlin thought Kyiv might collapse in days or weeks. Instead, we got one of the bloodiest and most expensive wars Europe has seen since World War II. Hundreds of thousands dead or wounded. Entire cities destroyed. Millions displaced. Massive sanctions on Russia, NATO expanding even more, Europe rearming, and global energy and food markets thrown into chaos. And after all that, the front lines have barely moved in the last couple of years. That's the really important part here. Militarily, both sides are exhausted. Russia controls large parts of eastern Ukraine, especially around Donbass, but it still hasn't fully achieved its original objectives. Ukraine, meanwhile, has survived, resisted, and inflicted enormous costs on Russia, but it also hasn't been able to fully reclaim occupied territory. So what you're seeing now may not be victory. It may simply be reality setting in. And then there's Trump. This is where things get politically explosive. According to reports, Trump pushed for this temporary ceasefire running from May 9th through May 11th, tied to Russia's Victory Day celebrations. The agreement reportedly includes a pause in major combat operations and a massive prisoner exchange, 1,000 prisoners from each side. That prisoner swap alone is significant. In wars like this, humanitarian exchanges are often one of the first signs that communication channels are becoming more serious. Now, does this mean a full peace deal is close? Probably not. Even the Kremlin itself is warning that real peace is still a very long way off. And honestly, there are still gigantic problems standing in the way. The biggest one? Territory. Russia currently occupies major parts of eastern and southern Ukraine. Ukraine refuses to formally surrender that land. Russia refuses to give it back. That's the core issue. And then you have the political problem. Putin reportedly says he would only meet directly with Zelensky after a final peace framework already exists. In other words, he doesn't want negotiations on camera. He wants a finished deal first. That tells you something important. Both sides are deeply worried about appearing weak because this war stopped being just a military conflict a long time ago. It became about identity, national survival, historical memory, even personal political survival for the leaders involved. And speaking of historical memory, there's another layer here people outside the region sometimes miss. This ceasefire started during Russia's Victory Day celebrations. That's the annual event marking the Soviet Union's victory over Nazi Germany in World War II. For Putin, Victory Day is sacred politically. It's central to the story the Kremlin tells about Russia itself, the idea of Russia as a nation that sacrifices, survives, and defeats existential enemies. But this year's parade in Moscow was reportedly scaled down heavily. Fewer displays, less military hardware, more security fears, concerns about Ukrainian drone strikes, and symbolically, that matters a lot. Because for years, Putin projected confidence and inevitability. This year felt more defensive, more cautious, almost like the Kremlin itself understands the costs of continuing forever. Now here's the bigger geopolitical question. What role does America play from here? If Trump really is positioning himself as the broker of a future settlement that changes global politics dramatically. Remember, Europe has largely approached this war with a strategy of long-term pressure on Russia, sanctions, weapons support for Ukraine, economic isolation. Trump's approach appears more transactional, more focused on freezing the conflict quickly, even if it means difficult compromises. That difference could create tensions inside the Western alliance itself, because European leaders worry that a rushed peace deal could reward Russian aggression. Ukraine worries about being pressured into territorial concessions. Russia worries about losing leverage if the war drags on economically. And then there's China quietly watching all of this. Beijing has learned a lot from this war, about sanctions, about drones, about Western unity, about how difficult modern invasions actually are. So, if this conflict really does begin winding down, it could reshape the entire global balance. Not just Europe. Energy markets could stabilize. Defense spending priorities could shift. NATO's future mission could evolve. And global attention may move toward the Pacific and tensions around Taiwan. That's why this moment feels bigger than just a 3-day ceasefire. It feels like the first real acknowledgement from multiple sides that endless war may not be sustainable anymore. But, and this is important, ceasefires are fragile. Even during this current pause, both Russia and Ukraine are already accusing each other of violations. Smaller attacks and drone strikes are still being reported. So nobody should assume peace is guaranteed. In fact, history tells us the opposite. Some wars become more dangerous during negotiations because both sides try to improve their positions before any final settlement. Still, psychologically, something has changed. When Putin starts publicly talking about the war ending, when prisoner swaps grow larger, when outside powers intensify mediation, when even symbolic ceasefires happen, those are signs that the political environment is shifting. Slowly, unevenly, maybe temporarily, but shifting. And honestly, after 4 brutal years, even a small shift matters. Because the scariest thing about this war was never just the battlefield itself. It was the fear that the world was drifting into a permanent era of escalation between nuclear powers. Maybe this ceasefire fails. Maybe fighting resumes immediately. Maybe negotiations collapse again. But maybe, just maybe, we're watching the first cracks in a conflict that once looked completely endless. And that alone makes this story worth paying attention to. All right, guys, that's it for today. Keep an eye on this ceasefire over the next few days, because what happens now could shape Europe, Russia, Ukraine, and even American politics for years to come. See you next time.